Slide 7 shows our starting point, the fraud-resistant organization. In brief, the report drives home the point that organizations that encourage ethical behavior are more resistant to misconduct of all kinds, including financial reporting fraud. I should note that the focus of the anti-fraud collaboration is on financial reporting fraud in publicly traded companies, but the tools and techniques highlighted in the report are applicable to private companies, nonprofits, and government agencies as well. And they also are effective for frauds of all sizes, not just material frauds. While all participants in the financial reporting supply chain influence corporate culture, the anti-fraud collaboration's view is that culture begins with the tone at the top, with the company's most senior leaders. It then cascades through the entire organization to create the mood in the middle and the buzz at the bottom, reflecting and reinforcing that tone at the top. So turning to slide 8, Tracy, I'm going to start with you. Management has primary responsibility for setting the tone at the top and establishing the corporate culture. So why don't you share with our audience what some of the key elements of a good program are?
Sure, thank you, Cindy. Well, at first, it's very important that the top management establishes and communicates company values, and that could be in a variety of ways, including annual ethics training. And it's very important that not only your offices nationally but globally are considered during this process, and even more importantly, that on a daily basis, top management does focus on setting that tone and positive daily behavior. I think it's also important that there's an expectation that employees will do the right thing, and how that can be established is through the goal setting process and through performance evaluation, setting those expectations of what employees need to do and how they need to do the right thing. I think it's really important that top management not only talk the talk, but walk the talk. So most importantly, that was even mentioned in a recent SEC Enforcement Director's speech, and stating that internal controls or compliance processes, just having them in place isn't enough. It's about how you utilize that process. So it's very important that everyone's actions speak louder than words. Building an environment that employees feel comfortable about bringing forward bad news. Don't shoot the messenger. I think it's very important that top management has an open and honest communication and dialogue with employees so that they feel very comfortable in having those honest conversations to make sure we mitigate financial reporting fraud. And most importantly, when companies do value ethical performance, misconduct is substantially lower in organizations, less pressure and less retaliation.
So Ken, a lot of people might argue that the top of an organization is the board of directors or the audit committee. So explain to us what role you think that the board of directors, and particularly the audit committee, play in setting the tone at the top.
Sure. Well, clearly I think the audit committee, and frankly I think the entire board, should take the leadership in setting the tone at the top as part of the culture. But important part of that is what exactly are we looking for when we look at culture? And while collegiality, I think, is very, very important, I think one of the key issues beyond collegiality is there has to be a culture, a tone that manageable dissent, I'll call it manageable dissent, is okay. And I think an important aspect of the right culture is that, and actually Tracy hit on a couple of these things, is that you can say things which maybe are not groupthink and it's found to be acceptable. Now, tone at the top, to be blunt with you, I think it's fairly easy to set as far as telling people what it should be. Worst thing happen, you get the person in a headlock and you say, this is what I want you to do. They're probably not going to forget that. But tone at the middle, that is something that I think is extremely difficult to set. And one of the roles that I think the board and certainly the audit committee has is to understand how management evangelizes that tone and culture that they want throughout the organization. Because a lot of things that we're talking about, a lot of these frauds that we're talking about are actually, they start somewhere in the middle of the organization. And what my experience indicates is that evangelizing that can be extremely difficult, and we need to look at different ways to get that accomplished. Tracy hit on a couple of them, performance evaluations, which I think are absolutely critical, Tracy. I think you're right on the money there. Another opportunity might be exit interviews. Talk to some people who have left the organizations. Hopefully you're doing exit interviews to find out what they saw, what they actually believe. It's kind of like your last sentences as you walk out the door. There's probably a lot of honesty in there. So it's all about tone at the, first of all, defining what tone is that you want, what kind of culture you want. It's kind of like what you told your kids, don't listen to what I say, but watch what I do. And then try to find ways to make sure it's being evangelized and to make sure that the scent is okay.
That's great. And that actually answers one of the questions that we've already received from our viewing audience about what are some tangible examples of a valuable and valuing an ethical culture. And Ken, you mentioned that perhaps the middle is just as important, if not more important, than the tone at the top, what we call the mood in the middle. And the Ethics Resource Center recently issued a study on ethical leadership, and they asked employees how they evaluate their superiors. And so I'm just curious, Tracy, I'll start with you. Were there any surprises in that study that you found?
Not at all, and actually just to reiterate Ken's comments about that mood in the middle, you know, it's important that, you know, that middle management, along with top management, is viewed as treating each other with dignity and respect. So no matter at what level you are in the organization, there's a mutual respect and honesty, you know, in interaction. Sharing credit and successes. It's important that the middle and top management does share in the success and not so quick to point the finger in a crisis, and that we all know we have something, we're all in it together, and that we really care about getting to the end game.
Great. So let's move on to slide 10. And Karl, I'm going to turn it over to you now and ask, what are some of the key ways that organizations can reinforce the importance of ethical behavior for their employees? And again, this goes to one of the questions that we got. Give us some real examples.
Well, certainly. I think you know, bringing it down from the tone at the top, it's very important that we can have consistent behavior from all members of management that stress the critical thinking and analysis and challenging one another, asking questions. Now, there's things that we can do and we should have in place, like a code of ethics. A code of ethics basically lays out for us what we want to be as a company ethically. And we need to communicate that throughout the entire organization and do it on a regular basis. Have people read it, have people sign it, have people acknowledge it, at least annually. A hotline, which we'll talk further about today, a place where people can call, a place where people can feel comfortable sharing bad news.
Another one of the questions that we've gotten from our viewing audience. Yeah. So it's good that we'll talk about that.
With that, then, it's also the support network that's there for employees actually to be able to make those calls and feel comfortable communicating.
You know, if I could add a comment, Karl, you know, one of the things that I think becomes important is not just the existence of these activities, but the visibility of the activities and the codes. There are a lot of decisions that get made on a day-to-day basis that could be done against an ethical framework. And very often, teams within a company will have those conversations and maybe not explicitly draw on the ethical framework. They may speak to it or think about it and get to the right answer, but they don't necessarily talk with their team members about, okay, what is the you know, how does this fit in with our company's ethics? And I really do believe that more frequent explicit discussion around how the pros and cons of decisions that are faced fit into those frameworks is helpful in raising elevating the consciousness around the ethical issues.
Well, you bring up a great point, because you need your team to do these things, right? Yep. Normally, I mean, there's obvious examples, but normally it's not black or white. You know, you're going to rob that store, you're not going to rob that store. That's not really what the issues are generally. Usually what they are shades of gray. And unless you have your whole team around you to help you figure out what the right shade is and whether or not it's going in the right direction, it really, really becomes difficult. We probably, I don't think, want any Lone Rangers out there. We want people to feel as if they're part of a network all that's supporting what it is that the organization wants.
So how does this apply to the board? Sometimes you hear about zero tolerance for violations
Right.
of the code of ethics or of the culture of the organization. But does that include the board as well?
Absolutely. I think absolutely it includes the board. There's a recent case, well, not so recent anymore, happened in Texas. We probably all remember it. Somebody came into the room and said, I've got a really great transaction here. It really doesn't fit into our code of ethics, so we'll have to suspend it for a brief period of time in order to do this, but it's best for everybody. That's probably not a good decision, right? I really think that the board has to constantly be sending and showing that it is a zero tolerance kind of thing. And a big part of that, I go back to my earlier comment, deals with the ability to be skeptical. I'm not talking about being skeptical to the point that nothing gets done, but we have to be able to recognize that dissent is okay. And that maybe it's not going to be 100% solution all the time, but if we show that dissent is okay, and we show that people are really serious about this, people will figure it out. I actually don't think people want to be part of an organization that struggles with culture and tone. I think people want to be part of some better thing. And I think it's up to the board, Cindy, to start that process by showing the way. That's why I say it's kind of the leader on this thing, in my view.
So let's move over to slide 11 and continue on with this theme, because we've gotten several questions about, again, give us specific examples of components of a strong ethical culture. And so we've got some of the thoughts up here. And as the audience is looking at slide 11 and thinking through some of these points, I want to open it both to Karl and Tracy, because you're inside the company. And talk about that, we all know that companies have to assess the risks within the company. And finding out, probing where the company might be vulnerable to fraud. And then also to set up a system of controls around those risks and then continue to monitor those. So discuss with us the importance and the components of a control environment within an organization for deterring and detecting financial reporting fraud, and also what the greatest challenges for monitoring and maintaining that effective control environment will be. So Karl, I'll start with you.
Well, certainly. I think even playing off the last slide and kind of coming in from a board perspective, something that we spend a lot of time talking about is transparency and sharing the right information with the board, that they actually can make decisions, understand what is happening. So it's putting the right information about fraudulent activity in front of them. And as we bring that down into management, you think of the fraud triangle with pressure, opportunity, and rationalization. In this report that was put together, the Fraud Resistant Organization, which I enjoyed reading a lot, 2/3 of U.S. employees cited pressure to do whatever it takes. So when companies are so metric driven and so pressured to make the numbers, the gray area that you mentioned, becomes maybe a little more wiggly. So I think we have to understand the pressures that people are under in their everyday roles. And then the opportunity side is about really putting in place preventive and detective controls. Most fraud-related controls are detective in nature after the fact. But there are opportunities actually to build some preventive controls around analytical activity that actually can point us to where these things are occurring. So a little bit about reducing work pressures, a little bit about limiting the opportunity and knowing when there are patterns taking place that need to be looked at. Don't give them the opportunity to rationalize it's okay, and really be transparent about that communication, coming back up to management, senior management, and the board of directors.
And just to expand upon your comment about the level of information that gets to the board, and I think that's very important at every single level. So it's very important that every level employee feels that they are transparent in the level of data and financial information that they're providing, so it appropriately goes up to the chain and ultimately to the board of directors to make the best decision for the organization. It's interesting, I actually had witnessed an investigation of just a basic breach of segregation of duties, and we go back to that fraud triangle of pressure, opportunity, and rationalization. And an AP supervisor had so much pressure. He saw a fraud going on with the controller of this organization, just simply approving and signing checks for his own personal use. But it came down to that there was really no help or hotline available in that organization to give that employee the opportunity to report it. And of course the pressure is that he has a family to provide for. And you know, we hear a lot about those examples, and I think it's critically important what's listed on this screen, that these are all in place so that in the event of any type of breach, that an employee feels comfortable to come forward without retaliation in the organization.
You know, I look at that list, and what occurs to me is an old adage that no matter the system of internal controls, there's weaknesses. And the question really becomes, are they being exploited?
Exactly.
And if they are being exploited, or if somebody spots it being exploited, if we had some of those things that are listed on that slide, it would make it a heck of a lot easier to get to somebody who actually can make the correction. So the question really becomes, are the weaknesses being exploited? And of course, you ultimately have to figure out what some of those weaknesses might be to determine if they are in fact being exploited.
So to come back to the audience question that Cindy asked us about, which was, what are tangible examples? The examples we've been talking about that are on the slide are examples of what to do when something goes wrong. And if things are going well, hopefully we don't have too many examples of that within our organization.
Right.
So we also have to have in place ways to make the message a constant drumbeat without things going wrong. One of the things, and there are some tangible techniques. A small thing that we do within our organization at Crowe Horwath is that we have a four-pillared value system that we call Care, Share, Invest, and Grow. And we have a program where people can give awards to each other when they exhibit behavior that's in line with the positive aspects of those ethics. And it's a fairly big deal around our organization. And in that way, the concepts are in front of people all the time, even though something hasn't necessarily gone wrong. But there's positive reinforcement around living the cultural dimensions that we've set forth.
Well, I'm going to move us on to slide 12 because
Cindy, could I just interrupt for
Sure,
half a second
sure.
and go back for 1 second? I want to give you some more examples of what you're describing that I think are important. If we're aware of what's going on, especially at the board level, perhaps at certain times we should be more vigilant than other times. So a couple of examples of that, I think. I'll call them yellow flags. Comp plans that have cliff funding in them. You hit this number, you get it all. You don't hit this number, you don't get it. If you've got plans like that and you get close to the number, sane people would say, we ought to take a hard look at that. Maybe somebody is in Senate, they will actually exploit something in order to get across the finish line. New acquisitions, bringing new companies in, where the folks of that acquired company may not have the culture and tone of your existing company. We ought to have our antenna up high on that. Or when we're operating in new cultures, how many times have we seen that? There are cultures where, unfortunately, bad behavior is, it's not reported, it's measured. In those cases, if we're into a culture like that, we ought to have our antenna up high to make sure that we've properly evangelized what we want to do. In the accounting world, there's going to be lots of reasons for new systems coming up, right? We're going to have lease accounting, revenue recognition. So we got these big, new, hairy systems that are going to be developed. Clearly, most of them will have weaknesses in the beginning. That's all part of the process. We need to be very vigilant that, in fact, weaknesses are not being exploited. So I think there's things that we can do, Cindy, to help ourselves.
Well, I think that's a good point about the new systems coming on because of some of the new accounting policies.
Right.
So.
Well, absolutely. And when those new systems go online, we should actually be building the control environment up front actually designing in the detective and preventive controls sooner, right, rather than after the fact.
Right. I think that's a critical point. That sounds like a topic for maybe a future webcast. So let's move on to slide 12, because I do want to talk a little bit about the new COSO framework that was unveiled in May of 2013. And what it might mean for companies. So I'm actually going to start with you, Rick, and ask what kind of questions are you getting from companies? I know that this has been somewhat, not controversial, but maybe confusing. When does it go into effect? What are the differences between the old framework and the new framework? And so either from management or audit committees, what kind of questions are you getting?
Well, the first question we usually get is there a shortcut? And the answer is unfortunately no, there's not a shortcut. Generally speaking, the first question we really get is why this change? And without spending the entire time on that, the bottom line is that the business environment's a lot different today than it was in 1992 when the first framework came out. A lot more globalization and a lot more technology. And I think that what we recognized is that elements of the old framework just didn't adapt to that very well. So the way we guide our clients, and we say, look, the best way to do this is read it and understand it, and then take a zero-based approach to it. Probably you're going to find that there are not radical differences in what you end up designating as key controls and how you test them and so forth. But what you may find are pockets where you didn't think about controls really being appropriate in that area. The other reason, frankly, that we suggest a bit of a zero-based approach is that it's now been a number of years since Sarbanes-Oxley required internal control reporting, and like anything, it can get a little stale after you've been doing it for a number of years, and this is a good opportunity to kind of take a deeper dive back into that internal control documentation that you have and move forward. From a timing standpoint, Cindy, generally speaking, the sooner the better seems to be the regulatory viewpoint. It does appear that companies can stay on the old framework for calendar 14 without really too much challenge. COSO is going to stop supporting the old framework, actually 3 weeks ago, I think, roughly. So we really need to begin thinking about moving on to the new framework. And I guess one last small thing, it's a nit that only accountants appreciate, but in the reporting that both the company and the auditors do now, they need to identify which of the COSO frameworks are being followed in their public reporting.
Okay. So going on to slide 13, and Ken, this talks about the effective board oversight of risk. Right. And you hit some of these points earlier. And so luckily, though, one of our viewers asked a question that just tees this up very nicely, and that is what controls can be put in place by the board to ensure open lines of communication and transparency between staff and the board without being filtered by either the CEO or very senior management. So as we look at the effective board oversight, I suspect that the board members and the audit committee members are going to want to talk to various people in middle management or senior management, but outside the CEO's ears. What advice do you have?
Okay, maybe I'll answer that by coming about it through the side door, because I think it relates well to a couple of the other comments I was going to make. I think there's 4 things that we can focus on here. One, understand the company strategy. We just issued a blue ribbon commission on this, and we said that the old model of review and consent, that model is probably long past its shelf life. What we're suggesting today is being active partners in the development of the strategy. And that's a great place, Cindy, where boards can come to other persons other than the C-suite and talk about the possibility of executing on the strategy. It's one thing to develop a strategy. It's quite another to actually execute it. And I think that many times we perhaps have not done a good enough job to determine whether or not we have the systems and the people in place to actually execute the strategy. Here's a great opportunity to do that. to get out and talk to people. What do you think about this? What do you think about that? A second area, understand the incentives. If the board truly understands the incentives, now I don't mean just pay. I'm talking about the incentives to get ahead. If let me get it, make it black and white for a second. If you have to be a yes person to get ahead, that's probably not a good thing. You don't want to have those signals all over the place, because then you're not going to get any reporting. So again, that comes back, I think, to tone and culture. To understand the incentives, to understand why people get ahead, get involved in talent management. In fact, compensation committees are changing their name to compensation and talent management. Really, really important. I mean, you want to talk about diversity in companies, et cetera. Here's really where the rubber hits the road. So I think there's a lot that can be done just in the whole area of incentives. 3, there's going to be pressures, right? Nobody wants to not hit the earnings number, right? The whisper number even. People want to hit those numbers. There's lots of other things going on in addition to just hitting numbers. So the pressure is always there. The question in my mind is, how is management dealing with the pressures? If they're just wiping it under the rug, that's probably not awfully good. If they're being tough on the people but not tough on the problem, that's probably exactly the opposite of what you want to do. You need to have a really good understanding of how companies, people are being involved in the pressures. Fourth thing I would point out is, and again, this is a great opportunity to talk to the people in the business, understand what the emerging issues are. What are the emerging issues? We talk about asymmetric information risk. What we mean by that is board members have way less information than management people. So the question becomes, how do you determine that asymmetric information risk has become too high? One of the ways you do that is actually talk to staff. Talk to them and hear what they say, stand it up against what you're hearing, and sometimes you're going to walk away and say something just is not right here. So it's a question of understanding what the emerging issues are, understanding what the staff knows that perhaps you do not know, but all under this umbrella. How in the world do we get it all done? And if anybody of our listeners has good ideas on how to get that done, I'm all ears. Okay. But when I think about the task, and I think about the fact that audit committees ought to be spending the bulk of their time discussing, not listening to presentations and monologues, and then we're trying to do all these other things, it is a real difficult task. And I think that's one of the reasons why audit committees in particular, boards in general, ought to be resourced better, maybe a whole lot better. And we really need to start to think about the kinds of folks that actually have the time to sit on these boards, Cindy.
Okay, that's good food for thought. I'm going to move us along to slide 14, just because we have got a number of questions about whistleblower helplines and features of a well-developed whistleblower helpline. We've gotten questions, Karl, and I know that at MetLife, your whistleblower program is available in over 50 countries and extends to not just your employees, but customers and vendors. We also know from the ACFE, the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, that most frauds are uncovered by tips through the whistleblower helpline. So talk to us, Karl, about what are the key tips that you can give our audience as to what makes a good whistleblower helpline.
Well, certainly. You know, first, I think the paper actually said some very good things about this. That the hotline would be available, one number, multiple languages translated, and that it would go to 2 places within the organization. So these are all very good practices. To have a common phone number that's available on an intranet, that is communicated, that it ties to the corporate ethics policies, to the code, and then when things come in, right? So it has to be available, it has to be communicated. But when things come in, it actually has to be treated very confidentially. You know, someone's manager should not be aware If I called, my manager should not know that I called. There should be an opportunity to have that be reviewed in a very confidential way. One of the things that you know, kind of I've learned over time is if you actually put yourself in the position of the individual that's calling, usually it's not me calling, right? It is someone who may be an assistant, may be a staff individual. They have not slept for days, right? Or thought about this for weeks. They've seen their boss do something they don't think is right, and it's been eating them up for a long time. They have to make this phone call, and they do. So it's very important that we actually get back to them, and we treat it in a very you know, thoughtful way. Get the facts and do an appropriate investigation. In our world, our investigatory group is in our compliance department, and every tip is followed up upon. You know, most tips don't amount to anything. Most tips are really more HR, you know, kind of I don't like my manager or something they did. But there are ones that actually require a great deal of work and result in action. So it's very important that actually then coming out of all that, management's actions are consistent, they're prompt, and that creates kind of awareness that actually all this works within the organization, and that kind of helps with a very positive environment around the hotline. So I guess the moral of my story would be actually to care about the individuals that are making the call, but actually to have the program in place and follow up accordingly.
Yeah, I think that what's interesting about the ACFE report, that when it comes out annually, is that while tips are the biggest source of fraud, of uncovering the fraud, also employees are most concerned about retaliation or not having the tip being taken seriously.
Right.
So there's that kind of conflict or dichotomy, and so I think following up and making sure employees understand that it's going to be taken seriously is important.
Could I just to follow on that, how does the panel feel about, panelists, feel about periodic reports as to what's been happening on the hotlines? I know a lot of companies, everything goes in, but nothing ever comes out. You never hear that there were, you know, 41 of these things and 38 of them were really HR, should have been reported here, or whatever we want to say, but report back. What do you think? Is that good or bad?
What I was going to comment on was kind of close to that. I think one of the nuances of the whistleblower hotline is that its activity is a barometer of the tone in the company. If you're not getting comments, people are afraid to comment. It probably doesn't mean everything's just great. And we know that because of this high number of, say, HR-related comments that Karl mentioned. You know, it's easy to call some of those a nuisance and a waste of resources, but what really happens, you can say, is when we're getting those calls, people feel comfortable making them. And if your hotline's not active, then it leads me to wonder what's in the culture that's stopping people from making those calls. So to your point, Ken, I think that most of my clients that operate hotlines report the statistics at least at the board level. By category, you know, how many are open, what are resolved, what were serious, but and they pay a lot of attention to you know, the nature and timing and placement and source of all these comments to think about the culture, not just about the identifying the bad behavior.
Do they report it beyond the board, though? Do they report it back to the company employees?
They don't publish it to the company in general, but as Karl said, they're very diligent about getting back to the whistleblower themselves about we took your complaint seriously, and in fact most of the good processes include multiple touch points with the whistleblower, because these things often take a bit of time to deal with.
Tracy, you want to
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think those points are great, and if you think from a circular reference perspective, the fact that you do care and the attention is given and there's a timely report that shows the turnaround of the response to that whistleblower enforces that culture of open communication. So it's really that, and to your point, very well said, if you're not getting a lot of those calls, you don't think everything that is perfect. So that is a mechanism to perhaps change the culture to a more positive one in communication.
I hate to do this because we've got a number of questions from the audience about the whistleblower program, but we've got a lot more content to cover here. I will just note for the audience that last July the Anti-Fraud Collaboration did a webcast specifically on whistleblower programs, and so I would invite our viewers to go to the CAQ's website or the Anti-Fraud Collaboration website, and you can pull up that whistleblower webcast that specifically deals with a number of these issues.